Welcome to Inspire Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Hey, welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change. Here in Australia right now, it's Sunday morning, and as I'm looking out the window, there is a raging rainstorm happening. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning this is that just a few weeks ago, we were all hoping for rain. Why? Because we were on fire, quite literally. So in essence, we've gone from a drought-stricken, burning landscape to a country that's now being flooded by torrential rain, and it's a big storm. And watching the media was really interesting because whilst the fires were burning, everybody was talking about, we need rain and how good it would be about rain and, it'd be just lovely. And now, over the last few days, as this rainstorm is setting in, the papers are filled with the catastrophes of floods and torrential downpours and the dangers of all that. Now, why am I mentioning this in an episode or in a podcast about change? Well, the reason why I'm mentioning it is that essentially it's a really good metaphor for life. Because sometimes the very thing we want can actually become a problem. Not only that, but it seems that for us as human beings, quite often the thing that comes up for us is that the thing we can't have is what we want, and when we get it, we complain about it. Now, my predisposition with all of this is to essentially go with the flow. This is what it is. Weather is like this. Now, the fires were somewhat differently, and if you listen to previous podcasts, we had some serious problems with them. And they were unprecedented in their ferocity and their scope. And there were a lot of factors that fed into that. And I'm not going to go into the politics or anything like that right now. But there are times, for example, with issues like the weather, where we can't expect it to be always the same and perfect and a nice balance. There's going to be some serious ups and some serious lows. And so as a human being, one of the things that I need to look at is how do I effectively deal with this? What is it that's going to make me flexible and adaptive enough to be resilient in a changing environment? And environments do change. Now, that metaphor also applies to me as an individual. Now, the problem is that our capacity to increase our self-awareness and to become more flexible and adaptive and therefore resilient is often encroached on. Now, as you know, in Making Good Men Great, I talk a lot about the toxicity of patriarchy. It is an ideology that directly challenges my well-being and that of all the people that I'm in relationship with. So in the first part of this podcast, I want to talk a bit about patriarchy, well-being, and the underlying beliefs that challenge my resilience, that stop me from being adaptable. Because, as I said before, things change. Change is a constant. The question is, how am I and the people around me going to deal with it in an effective way? Now, I was having a discussion with a colleague of mine, and we were talking about the current issues about men and women and what we face in our society today. Yeah, especially because both of us are essentially clinicians. We talked about things such as depression, suicide, alienation, and isolation. And I propose that at the root of a lot of this is actually the patriarchal socialization that men and women, and again, let me remind you, patriarchy is genderless. We spoke about how that fits. Now, he specifically challenged me on the idea that a lot of this can be understood through the root cause, patriarchy. He's particularly wary of those sorts of issues just being explained in what he called that sort of simplistic way. And in part, I understand where he's coming from. The problem is that understanding the root cause for many of the issues that we face psychologically, sociologically, politically, economically, do come back to the patriarchal ideology. It is infused into the fabric of our society and culture. Now, one of the things that I pointed out, and we discussed quite at length, was the idea that everything that human beings experience is essentially dispositional. That is, it comes back down to me. And in previous podcasts, I talked about Philip Zimbardo, and he does clearly outline that there is a difference between dispositional, i.e., what I as an individual am prone to, and what happens to me in situations. Now, my view is that when we talk about the psychological well-being of individuals, let's talk about men, we can't just say that the way that I am, like stoic, strong, not empathic, or having low empathy or low emotional expression, is purely down to me at an almost biological level. That's a nonsense. I watch children and I work with adolescents a lot. And having brought up a daughter and a son and being a grandfather to boys and a girl, I can tell you that the boys are often emotionally, when they're little, a lot more expressive and also require a lot more emotional support than the girls. Girls frequently are quite independent at a very early age. And so we need to then go, okay, well, if it's not entirely dispositional, what types of situations and what in the situations contribute to the way that we are? Now, in that context, in the situational circumstances and environment, this is where we come down to the idea of socialization and the influence of ideologies. And in this case, I'm talking about the toxicity of patriarchy. So simply having a reductionist explanation, i.e., that all the negative things, the bad things that happen from human beings, from men in particular, is because of the way that we are inherently, is in my view, nonsense. It just doesn't make any sense. It's an interaction between me and my social context. Now, I would even go so far as to say that the socialization shapes the person's disposition much, much more than the other way around. And I see that when I work with people who've been traumatized and they're experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. This is not a dispositional thing. Post-traumatic stress disorder is the normal adaptive response to a highly threatening experience that person's had. An experience that leaves them psychobiologically scarred. And therapy is there to help that person, one, experience the trauma or re-experience the trauma in a safe way so we can desensitize it and help the person to reprocess it in order for them to become more flexible and adaptive and then to re-establish their resilience. Now, the other aspect that happens in this situational context is the beliefs and attitudes that we're infused with. And Albert Ellis, who was a psychotherapist and established a therapy called rational emotive behavior therapy, was very clear that most people's emotional disturbances had their origins in irrational beliefs and self-talk. And that supports the very point that I'm making, is that where did those beliefs and self-talk come from? Well, they're internalized from our society. So, for example, boys very quickly learn that, it's not okay to express what you're feeling. So boys don't cry, for example. So they suppress a very important emotional function that leads them to generalizing that behavior so that they suppress most feelings. When I see, young teenagers, and I get parents often making, the observation that, we're going through the Neanderthal phase where, he's dragging his knuckles on the ground and simply grunts as responses. That is not an inherent aspect. Most kids from about the moment they can speak to the time that they actually get into high school, the boys are often really, really verbal. Now, in their verbal skills, they might lag a little bit behind girls initially, but my experience is they certainly catch up. So, what are some of the core beliefs that Albert Ellis talks about that become, critically important when we try to understand men's well-being and the underlying beliefs that undermine well-being? Now, Albert Ellis suggests that there are three major musts that are at the root of our emotional distress. The first one is, I must do well and win the approval of others, or else I'm no good. Now, that's a really complex one that has a whole bunch of stuff embedded in it. Let me go on to the second one. The second one is, other people must do the right thing, or else they are no good and deserve to be punished. So in a sense, it's a sort of permutation on the idea that, we're either good or we're bad. It's that binary thinking that comes into play. It does not take into account situational influences. Now, the third one's really, really important because I think it's highly relevant to today's culture and society. And that is that life must be easy without any discomfort or inconvenience. Now, putting it that way, most of us go, well, that's a blatant nonsense. And if I come back to my introduction, how's that going to work when life inherently can be chaotic or always changing? That particular aspect interferes with my capacity to adapt. Why? Because I'm not going to want to put any effort into things. I'm not going to take responsibility and ownership over what I feel and how I behave and the decisions that I make. That's a very dangerous attitude to have. That's a very dangerous aspect to my living. And unfortunately, I watch this a lot with teenagers. And we as parents often actually provide the foundation for that. When I was talking recently to a group of parents, one of the things I put to them is, as a parent, what's your goal? What's your vision for your child? And most people said it's to make my kids happy. Now that's a major trap, because the reality is that if you want to put that into practice, you cannot, under any circumstances, expect them to do anything for themselves. Why? Because I bet your bottom dollar that at some point that kid's not going to like it. And he's going to go, I'm really unhappy with this. And then what are you going to do? Are you going to do it for them? And especially towards later childhood and early adolescence, if as a parent you keep doing for that child what they should be doing for themselves, you're setting that child up, whether it's a boy or a girl, for failure in life. they will not thrive, because they will expect their needs to be met immediately. They're taught that they don't have to experience discomfort and, sweat equity, and that therefore they don't have any tolerance to frustration. It's actually a very, very dangerous approach to take with a child. The thing that I point out when I'm parenting and when I talk about parenting and when I coach parents is my job is at times to help that child deal with being unhappy. It's a part of life. It's like being flooded because it's a rainstorm. You can't do anything about the rainstorm. So the result of these beliefs ultimately mean that we are inflexible, we don't adapt well, that we place unrealistic expectations on ourselves and others. One of the things that I hear with couples frequently, although it's getting less so, but somewhere it's always a little bit embedded in it, is that, well, my partner's job is to make me happy. No, it's the same fallacy as your job as a parent is not to make your child happy. It's to be their support and encourage and help them have the capacity to deal with problems. The other one is create an over-concern with others' opinions of oneself. Who cares what other people ultimately think? What matters is what you believe about yourself. And if you've got any sort of moral compass, you know when you're stuffing up. And you will hold yourself accountable for it, and hopefully you won't do it again. The other problem is that these beliefs make sure that one's self-worth is measured by achievements and popularity. Again, a serious, serious problem. I know lots and lots of people who are highly successful professionally, but they have no sense of self-worth. The moment they lose the external things that boost their status and their belief in themselves, they crumble, they fall apart. And the other bit, and I'm going to leave on this, is that it undermines our acceptance of ourselves. And our acceptance of ourselves is based on a singular important principle, and that is that I am a human being, and as a human being, I am fallible. Own it and learn from it, and don't do it again. And on that note, I'll leave you with more reflections until next time.
Thank you, Gunter, and thank you to our listeners. Inspired Change with Gunter Swoboda. Please join us every Wednesday for a new broadcast by visiting www.spreaker.com/show/inspire-change, which will feature all the ways you can listen. If you have comments or suggestions, email producer@studio3hollywood.net. Thank you and have an inspiring day.